The towering glass building reflected the dying sunlight, casting long shadows over the city. Inside its pristine walls, the corridors of Hale Industries buzzed with a murmur of employees wrapping up their day, oblivious to the presence of the man standing at the far end of the lobby. Dressed in a simple navy blue suit, without the expensive watch or the aura of power he usually carried, Richard Hale, the CEO of the very company, stood unnoticed, blending into the background. His cold blue eyes flickered with curiosity as he adjusted his tie and studied the front desk. A curved marble counter, polished to perfection, sat at the entrance, the receptionist chair vacant behind it. He had orchestrated this moment carefully. Sarah, the usual receptionist, had been given a generous 2-week paid vacation, and none of the employees had a clue about his little experiment. For weeks, Richard felt an unease settling in his gut. His empire, built from the ground up, was thriving, yet he sensed something was off. It wasn't the numbers. Those looked impeccable. It was something else, something intangible. The way his senior managers acted during board meetings, the whispered conversations that would end the moment he entered the room, the sudden resignations of long-term employees, all pointed towards something lurking beneath the surface. And so, he had devised this plan. For 2 weeks, he would pose as a new receptionist, seeing his company from a vantage point he had never experienced before. He wanted the unfiltered truth, the kind people hid from those in power. That night, he sat in his office one last time, reviewing security footage. His assistant, Peter, had assured him that everything was fine, that he was being paranoid. But as Richard watched the recordings, he noticed strange patterns. Employees slipping into an unused elevator on the east wing of the building. One that, according to the building plans, led nowhere. Documents disappearing from office desks, only to reappear hours later, untouched. And then there were the timestamps. Late hours, long after everyone was supposed to have left. Something was happening inside Hale Industries, and he was determined to uncover it. The next morning, Richard arrived early, dressed in a crisp white shirt and black slacks, his hair neatly combed back, but without the usual commanding presence he carried as CEO. He stepped behind the reception desk, smoothing out the surface with his palm, familiarizing himself with the computer setup. The day started as expected. Employees walked past, some offering him polite nods, others too engrossed in their conversations to acknowledge him. A few executives threw him dismissive glances, treating him as nothing more than background noise. Then, as the hours passed, he began to notice the little things. A man in a gray suit approached the desk around noon, his face tight with stress. "Sarah usually takes care of these," he muttered, sliding a file across the counter. "Confidential contracts. Just log them in the system, and don't ask questions." Richard took the folder, nodding. The documents inside weren't anything unusual, at least not at first glance. But the moment he flipped through them, he noticed something odd. The signatures at the bottom, they were forged. His heart pounded as he studied them closer. Whoever had signed these contracts had done so in the name of multiple clients, some of whom he personally knew would never approve of such deals. He kept his expression neutral, nodding as he set the folder aside. "I'll handle it," he said simply. The man gave him a wary glance before walking away, disappearing into the throng of employees. Richard's fingers hovered over the keyboard as he debated his next move. Confrontation was out of the question. He needed more information. He decided to log the documents as instructed, but not before making digital copies for himself. As the day went on, Richard became increasingly aware of the undercurrents of secrecy running through his company. The receptionist's desk, though seemingly insignificant, was a hub of information. People spoke freely in front of him, assuming he was just another faceless employee, someone who didn't matter. By the third day, he had compiled a mental list of anomalies, documents that didn't match their official records, employees who entered rooms that, according to company blueprints, didn't exist. And then there was the elevator, the one on the east wing. He had watched as multiple people stepped inside, the doors closing behind them, but they never seemed to reappear. He checked the security logs, but the system showed no record of the elevator being used. It was as if those employees had vanished into thin air. Curiosity burned inside him, but he knew he had to be careful. If someone was orchestrating something within his company, They had gone to great lengths to keep it hidden. If they suspected he was on to them, they might disappear before he could uncover the truth. And then on the fourth night, he finally saw something that chilled him to his core. He had stayed late under the pretense of organizing files, ensuring he was alone in the lobby. The office was silent, except for the distant hum of air conditioning. Then, at exactly 11:37 p.m., he heard it, a voice, faint, muffled, coming from the east wing. Heart hammering, Richard abandoned his desk and moved toward the source. The corridor was dimly lit, the glass walls of the offices reflecting his movements. He crept closer, following the whispering sounds, until he reached the elevator. The doors were slightly ajar. Inside, the buttons were labeled differently than the ones in the main lobby. Instead of numbers, there were symbols, ones he didn't recognize. A shiver ran down his spine. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside. He hesitated before pressing one of the symbols, but before he could make a decision, the doors slid shut on their own. The elevator jolted, descending into darkness. And then, a whisper close to his ear. "You shouldn't be here." The lights flickered violently, and then everything went black. Darkness swallowed Richard whole. The air inside the elevator turned stale, thick with an unfamiliar scent, dampness, metal, something faintly acrid. He reached out, fumbling for the buttons, but his fingers met nothing but smooth, cold steel. The symbols that had been there moments ago had vanished. A low hum reverberated through the walls, sending a vibration up his spine. Then, with a sudden jolt, the elevator stopped. A sharp ding echoed in the silence, and the door slid open. Richard hesitated, his heartbeat thudding in his ears. The hallway before him was nothing like the sleek, modern offices above. The walls were concrete, the air damp and heavy. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows on the cracked floor. The corridor stretched ahead, lined with doors, old, metal ones with tiny slits at eye level. Something was terribly wrong. He stepped forward cautiously, his footsteps barely making a sound against the cold floor. The silence was unnatural, suffocating. The only noise was the faint buzzing of a flickering light. Then, a whisper, faint just ahead. Richard stiffened, his breath hitching. He wasn't alone down here. Swallowing hard, he pressed forward. The first door to his left was slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness within. A rusted nameplate hung crookedly on it, but the letters were too worn to read. Another whisper, this time from behind him. He spun around, but the hallway remained empty. Goosebumps crawled up his arms. This wasn't just some forgotten basement level. This place wasn't supposed to exist. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, to get out while he still could, but he had come too far. For weeks, he had sensed something lurking beneath his company's polished surface, and now he was standing in the middle of it. Something moved at the end of the hallway, a shadow shifting just beyond the reach of the flickering light. Richard held his breath. A soft creak. A door slowly swinging open. He took a cautious step forward, straining to see inside. His fingers brushed against the metal frame as he peered in, and then a hand shot out from the darkness. Cold, clammy fingers latched onto his wrist with a desperate grip. Richard recoiled, but the grip tightened. A voice, hoarse, barely above a whisper, hissed through the gap. "They know. You have to leave. Now." Panic surged through him. "Who knows?" he whispered back, struggling against the iron grip. No response, just ragged breathing. Then from the depths of the room, something moved. Richard yanked his arm free, just as footsteps echoed down the hall. Heavy, deliberate. Someone was coming. He backed away, heart hammering in his chest. The footsteps grew louder, closer, then stopped. Silence. And then a voice, deep, smooth, and laced with something unreadable. "You're not supposed to be here." Richard turned sharply. A man stood a few feet away, dressed in a crisp black suit, his face eerily composed. His skin was pale, almost waxy, and his eyes dark, bottomless voids, bore into Richard with an unsettling intensity. The air seemed to shift around him, growing heavier. Richard forced himself to remain composed. "I got lost," he lied, his voice steady despite the tension coiling in his gut. The man tilted his head slightly, as if studying him. This level is restricted. You shouldn't have been able to access it. Richard squared his shoulders. I'm the new receptionist. No one told me this area was off limits. A flicker of something, recognition, amusement, crossed the man's face before he smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. Of course, he said smoothly. A mistake, I'm sure. He took a step forward. Richard instinctively stepped back. The man's smile widened. Come, I'll escort you back upstairs. Every instinct in Richard's body screamed not to follow him, but he had no choice. Without a word, he nodded and stepped into the elevator. The man followed, pressing a button Richard hadn't noticed before. The doors slid shut, enclosing them in silence. The ascent was slow, unbearably so. Richard could feel the man's gaze on him, unblinking. Finally, the doors opened to the familiar, brightly lit lobby. Richard stepped out, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The man lingered inside the elevator, watching him. Then, with a quiet ding, the doors slid shut. Richard turned, his mind racing. He had seen enough. He knew, without a doubt, that something dark was lurking beneath Hale Industries. And whatever it was, it knew him now, too. The lobby was exactly as Richard had left it, pristine, bright, and buzzing with employees going about their business. It was as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just ascended into a hidden floor that shouldn't exist. But he knew better. He could still feel the cold grip of that unseen hand from the basement, hear the ragged breathing and those whispered words. They know. You have to leave. Now. Richard sat behind the receptionist's desk, his hands gripping the edge, knuckles white. He needed to process everything. The elevator, the strange symbols, the man in the black suit, the rooms. Who was that man? A security officer? Someone higher up? More importantly, what was happening below Hale Industries? His gut told him that whatever was down there, it was wrong. He turned to his computer, determined to find answers. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he accessed the company's internal records. But something was off. The employee directory, something he had checked just yesterday, was missing names. He stared at the screen. There had been over 1,200 employees in the system. But now, 1,183. 17 names gone. Richard's breath hitched. He quickly checked the termination records, but there was nothing. No resignations, no dismissals, no explanations. These employees had just vanished from the system, as if they had never existed. He scrolled faster, looking for anything, emails, access logs, security reports, but it was like the system had been scrubbed clean. Something was deleting people. His heart pounded. Then, as if on cue, a voice behind him said, "Looking for something?" Richard turned sharply. It was Lisa, one of the senior HR managers. Her expression was neutral, but her eyes, dark and unreadable, studied him carefully. He forced a casual smile. Just getting used to the system. Someone asked me to check an employee record, but I think I must have the wrong name. Lisa nodded slowly, but something in her posture shifted. The system has been a little buggy lately, she said. If you need help, let me know. Of course. She lingered for a second too long before walking away. Richard exhaled. Lisa knew, not just about the missing employees, but about him. That night, Richard couldn't shake the paranoia creeping under his skin. He replayed the events in his head over and over again. The hidden floor, the people going missing, the strange man in the elevator. But one question haunted him the most. Where were they taking these employees? And then he realized the security cameras. His office had been recording footage for months. If something was happening, the evidence would be there. He waited until the office emptied out, then made his way to the executive floor. His real office. It was strange, stepping into the space he had abandoned for his undercover role. The leather chair, the glass table, the expensive whiskey on the shelf. It all felt foreign, but he didn't have time to think about that. He sat down, unlocking his personal server. And then he saw it. A file he hadn't noticed before. A single video, time-stamped 3 weeks ago. Richard clicked play. At first, the footage seemed normal. employees moving through the halls, going about their business. Then, at 1:42 a.m., movement. A man in a gray suit walking briskly toward the East Wing elevator. Richard leaned forward. A few seconds later, another figure appeared, a woman in business attire. She looked distressed, glancing over her shoulder. She followed the man into the elevator. Then, just before the doors closed, she turned toward the camera. Richard's blood ran cold. It was Sarah, his receptionist, the one he had given a vacation. Except if she had left on vacation. What the hell was she doing here, in the middle of the night, looking terrified? The elevator doors sealed shut. The footage sped forward. She never came back. Richard's hands trembled as he rewound the video, watching it again. Sarah wasn't on vacation. She had been taken. He had to find out what happened to her. And to do that, he needed to go back down there, to the hidden floor. Richard could no longer ignore the truth. Something sinister was happening inside Hill Industries, and it wasn't just shady business practices. Employees were disappearing. Files were being erased. And Sarah, his receptionist, had been taken. And now they knew he was looking. His gut told him that if he didn't act fast, he might be the next name wiped from the system. So, at 2:13 a.m., under the cover of darkness, Richard entered the building. The silence was suffocating. Offices that were usually filled with ringing phones and clacking keyboards were now eerily still. The security guards, usually stationed near the front, were missing. Richard made his way toward the elevators, his pulse hammering in his ears. The moment of truth. He pressed a button. Nothing. He pressed it again. Still nothing. Panic clawed at him. The secret floor. Had they locked it out after his last visit? Then, just as he was about to give up, the elevator dinged. The door slid open, revealing a pitch-black interior. He stepped inside. The panel was different this time. The buttons weren't labeled. No numbers. No letters. Just a smooth, featureless surface. Richard exhaled. Think. He pressed his palm against the metal. Nothing. Then he remembered. Last time, the man in the black suit had pressed something. A hidden key. Richard reached out and tapped in the area where he had seen the man touch. A low beep. Then motion. The elevator began to descend. The doors opened. The same cold, sterile hallway stretched before him. Dim fluorescent lights flickered. The walls were concrete, damp. The air was thick with an acrid metallic scent. But something was different. This time, he could hear things. Faint murmurs. He stepped forward cautiously, his breath shallow. Further down, a room was dimly lit from the inside. The door was slightly open. Richard peered through the gap. His stomach dropped. Inside were metal gurneys. Dozens of them, each one occupied. People, employees, strapped down. Some were unconscious. Others twitched violently, their limbs spasming. A few murmured incoherent words, eyes rolling back in their skulls. Machines beeped, for drips hung from metal poles, filled with some thick, black substance. A low, mechanical voice echoed through the room. Dosage complete. Monitoring vitals. Richard backed away, his heart racing. What the hell was this? Some kind of experiment? A soft sob caught his attention. He turned. A glass chamber stood at the far end of the room. Inside it, Sarah. She was strapped to a chair, her head slumped forward. Electrodes were attached to her temples, wires snaking up to a monitor. Her lips moved slightly, but no sound came out. Richard's chest tightened. She was alive. He rushed forward, his hands fumbling at the lock on the glass door. It wouldn't budge. A screen on the side flickered. Lines of unreadable data scrolled past. A digital waveform pulsed in sync with Sarah's weak movements. Then, a label appeared at the top of the screen. Consciousness transfer, phase 3. Richard's breath hitched. Consciousness transfer? The pieces slammed together in his mind. The missing employees. The wiped records. The strange black for fluid. They weren't just taking people. They were stealing their minds. Suddenly, a cold hand clamped down on his shoulder. Richard spun around. The man in the black suit stood there, his face as expressionless as ever. "You should not have come back," he said. Then, darkness. A sharp, searing pain shot through Richard's skull, and the world faded to black. Darkness. A numbing void swallowed Richard whole. His body felt heavy. His mind adrift. Then pain. A sharp, electric jolt shot through his skull, dragging him back to consciousness. His eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, he couldn't remember where he was. Then it hit him. The secret floor. The lab. The missing employees. Sarah. And now he was strapped to a chair. A blinding white light shone down on him. His arms were bound, cold metal cutting into his wrists. Electrodes clung to his temples. Wires slithered around him, feeding into machines that pulsed with eerie green light. In front of him, behind a thick glass partition, they were watching. Lisa, the HR manager, the man in the black suit, and another figure, a tall, skeletal man in a pristine lab coat. His face was gaunt, eyes sunken deep into his skull. He stepped forward, his voice calm and clinical. "Welcome, Mr. Hale." Richard's blood ran cold. They knew. They had known the entire time. "You should not have interfered," the man continued, adjusting the dials on a nearby console. "But your curiosity, well, it has provided us with an unexpected opportunity." Richard struggled, but his restraints didn't budge. "What the hell is this?" he spat. The doctor gave a thin, almost amused smile. "You were so desperate to understand, weren't you? Well, let me tell you." He gestured to the bodies strapped to gurneys. "The human mind is fragile. It deteriorates. It breaks. But with the right procedure, it can be extracted, preserved, and, if perfected, transferred." Richard's stomach churned. "The employees you've been so concerned about? Their consciousness, their essence, is no longer in their bodies." He pointed to a dark machine in the corner, a chamber lined with glass canisters. Inside each canister, a swirling black mist. Richard's breath caught. That's not possible." "Oh, but it is," the doctor said, eyes gleaming with something unnatural. "We have learned to remove consciousness from a living body and contain it. Soon, we will be able to implant these minds into new vessels." Richard's pulse pounded in his ears. They were stealing minds. And the missing employees? They weren't just missing. They were trapped. A sick realization hit him. "Sarah." He turned his head, his heart hammering. Sarah's body still sat in the glass chamber. Her eyes open, but empty. No light, no recognition, because she wasn't there anymore. Richard's throat closed up. No, you can't just... Lisa, the HR manager, finally spoke. "This was never meant for the employees," she said, folding her arms. "They were just experiments." Her gaze darkened. "But you, Mr. Hale, you're a much more valuable subject." Richard's veins turned to ice. "You think this company is yours," she continued. "You think you built Hale Industries? No, you were chosen, a placeholder, a public face." The doctor nodded. "And now, it's time for your transfer." Richard's breath hitched. "No," he whispered. He fought against the restraints, his body writhing, but it was useless. The doctor flipped a switch. A piercing, electric hum filled the room. The machine awoke. Richard's body seized as white-hot agony ripped through his skull. His thoughts, his memories, began to unspool, like threads being pulled apart. He tried to scream, but his voice was lost in the static. He could feel himself being peeled away, fading, falling. Then silence, darkness, weightlessness, a floating sensation, like drifting on an invisible tide. But he wasn't gone. He could still think, still see. Yet something was wrong. His vision returned, but not as it had been before. Everything looked warped, like he was staring through a fogged-up window. Then he realized he wasn't in his body anymore. He was inside the machine, trapped, a prisoner in his own company. Forever.